Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, November 16, 2022. The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is reelected by his Senate Republican colleagues as leader, beating back a challenge by Republican Senator Rick Scott. The secret ballot vote reportedly 37-10, with one voting present. And it comes after a motion from conservatives was defeated to delay the leadership vote till after the Georgia Senate runoff election on December 6th. Coming up, we hear from Senator McConnell and talk with the Washington Post political reporter. Following former President Donald Trump's announcement Tuesday night that he is running for president in 2024, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, seen as a potential rival for the Republican presidential nomination, asked today if there's a war brewing between the two. The U.S. Senate taking a step towards putting the right to same-sex marriage into federal law, with a dozen Republicans joining every Democrat to clear the 60 votes needed to advance the bill. The House passes a bill that limits the use of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, that keep victims of workplace sexual harassment and assault from speaking out. The Senate already passed this bill, so it's going to President Biden to be signed into law. Poland and NATO say the explosion that killed 2 people in a village in Poland on the border with Ukraine was likely from Ukrainian missile defense, not a Russian offensive strike. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says he sees no reason to doubt that, but that Russia is ultimately responsible because Russia is targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure with its barrage. And a U.S. House Rules Committee hearing today on seating a congressional delegate from the Cherokee Nation, almost 200 years after a treaty granted that representation. Now to the Senate Republican leadership elections. ABC News writing that Senator Mitch McConnell on Wednesday was comfortably reelected as the GOP leader in the upper chamber, despite a challenge, his first in 15 years, and despite intra-party finger-pointing over the GOP's disappointing performance in the midterm elections last week. Senator McConnell had faced opposition from Florida Senator Rick Scott, who mounted a historic campaign for the post that topped the Republican conference. The leadership vote, done by secret ballot behind closed doors in the ornate Old Senate chamber, was 37-10, with one member voting present, per Senator Kevin Cramer, Republican from North Dakota. The conference met for 3.5 hours, and an effort led by Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas, to postpone Wednesday's leadership vote also failed, with supporters garnering 16 votes per 2 GOP aides. That reporting from ABC News. Senator McConnell and others in the Senate Republican leadership, newly elected, held a news conference on the closed session.
Yes, you were reelected, but this is the first challenge you have faced in 15 years as leader. 10 senators voted against you, 1 voted present. So what lesson did you learn from this, and will you change your approach at all?
Yeah, first, I don't own this job. Anybody who wants to run for it can feel free to do so. And so I'm not in any way offended by having an opponent or having a few votes in opposition. As everyone has said, we had a good opportunity to discuss the various differences. People had a chance to listen to both candidates, and I'm pretty proud of 37-10.
Mr. Leader, can you respond to former President Trump announcing that he plans to run for re-election, and do you believe that will help or hinder your chances in the Georgia runoff?
The way I'm going to go into this presidential primary season is to stay out of it. I don't have a dog in that fight. I think it's going to be a highly contested nomination fight with other candidates entering, and it's all going to be quite good for you all to cover. How do you think it will impact
your runoff in Georgia? Do you want former President Trump to come to Georgia?
We're going to do everything we can to get Herschel Walker elected. We can't pretty well determine who's going to come in, and we'll see how that develops. Yeah.
Mr. Leader, as Monty said, first challenge in 15 years, has it made it more or less likely that you might consider stepping aside once you beat Mike Mansfield's record?
Look, I'm not going anywhere.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, at a news conference today. Behind him, the other members of the Senate Republican leadership. Senator McConnell is the longest-serving Republican Party leader in Senate history, 15 years. But as you just heard from the reporter, the record holder for leading any party, either party, in the Senate is by late Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana, who served 16 years, 1953 through 77. Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, supported Senator Rick Scott for minority leader. Senator Johnson explained why on Newsmax TV on Tuesday night.
I think we need a different governing model for our conference. I think we need a far more collaborative one, one that is really focused on fiscal sanity, bringing greater function to the Senate. You know, we're dealing with a $6.2 trillion a year entity here. And we don't really ever discuss the numbers. We don't lay out in an organized fashion how we're spending money. It just all of a sudden comes up and we're asked to vote for things, you know, multi-thousand-page omnibus spending bills, CRs, that type of thing. So, you know, hopefully the House in a majority can bring budget and appropriation function back. And all I want in the Senate is I want a more collaborative process. You know, run this more like a business. And of course, Rick Scott has, you know, a great deal of experience running large enterprises, executive governor of a state, did a lot of good things, signing to a certain extent, setting up Ron DeSantis for success. So I will support him. I'll be nominating him.
Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, on Newsmax television Tuesday night. More on today's re-election of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Joining us on the phone is Washington Post political reporter John Wagner. Thank you for being here. The Senate Republicans discussed and voted in private, but we're hearing something that came out of the room. What's the reporting?
Well, there was a pretty vigorous debate, first of all, as to whether they should even be, having this election today. There were certainly a number of senators who thought that they needed more time to assess why Senate Republicans really had a pretty dismal performance last week, and others who thought that they should at least wait until after the December 6th runoff in Georgia so that Herschel Walker, if he prevails, would be able to participate. But after that, there was a lot of talk that just continued. I mean, they met for about 3 hours about the direction of the party with a lot of recriminations, but ultimately McConnell prevailed.
Which senators supported Senator Rick Scott for leader and why?
Well, he got 10 votes. There was another senator who voted present. McConnell's been there for quite some time now, been the leader either in the majority or minority since 2007. And I think there is a sense that, especially given the performance a week ago, that it might just be time for some fresh blood. And, there are a lot of McConnell allies longtime allies who are now leaving the Senate. And they're being replaced in some cases by those who are not as loyal, or at least have questioned whether he should stay in charge.
Given that 10 of his members voted for somebody else, what might change in the way he leads the conference and maybe the conference rules?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. McConnell had a news conference afterward in which he suggested not a whole lot was going to change. He said they didn't hold it against anyone who chose to run against him, that he doesn't own the job. But he said he was also pretty proud of the vote total, having received, the support of 37 of his colleagues. So I don't think we're going to see any wholesale changes. It will probably be, there will be some frustration for, the Republicans in the minority. But their positions in some sense will be strengthened if there is, in fact, a House Republican majority, because the negotiations between the two chambers will be very different.
Talking with John Wagner from the Washington Post. What accounts for Senator McConnell's longevity as leader?
Well, you ask a good question. He has managed to negotiate and navigate, I guess I should say, between different factions of the party. He's not really identified so much with one or the other. He obviously he's an establishment Republican, but he seems to be able to work reasonably well with those who are to his right. And, there really wasn't anyone who emerged as an obvious alternative. Rick Scott, put himself forward, but he had some issues of his own. As being the chairman of the campaign arm of the Senate, the Senate Republicans, there are a lot of people who thought he should shoulder some of the blame, too, for their performance.
Speaking of that leadership position, Senator McConnell appearing with the other members of the Senate Republican leadership looked pretty similar, except for Senator Rick Scott's case.
Yes, Scott is being replaced by Senator Steve Daines as head of the NRSC, and he Daines was pretty upbeat at the news conference, but didn't really provide too many specifics on the direction they had or how the direction might be different. He said there would be lessons learned, and then expressed that he was ready to hit the ground running.
So there is still one more Senate race to go, and that's the runoff in Georgia. How is Senator McConnell now leading the effort to get that seat?
Well, he indicated at his news conference Tuesday that he's all in on that. Said as an aside that he generally isn't a fan of runoffs, but certainly is in this case because it gives Republicans another bite at the apple. And he said more generally that he thought the party had failed to connect with independents and moderate Republicans, that those voters seem to see too much negativity and chaos, were the words he used, coming from Republican candidates, including in Georgia. And he's hopeful that this will be a ship that they can right in the next couple of weeks.
John Wagner, Washington Post political reporter. His stories at WashingtonPost.com, and on Twitter it's at WP John Wagner. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Senator Rick Scott with a written statement today that has this line: although the results of today's elections warrant what we hope for, this is far from the end of our fight to make Washington work. A headline at thehill.com, Republicans divided as Donald Trump kicks off 2024 bid, referring to the former president's announcement Tuesday night that he's running for president again. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, tweeting, President Trump has my full endorsement and my support as our Republican nominee in 2024. And she included a clip from an event where Donald Trump promised to put America first if elected a second time. Governor Larry Hogan, Republican from Maryland, writing, doubling down on losing isn't just foolish, it's a gift to the Democrats. It's time to turn the page. Former President Trump spoke Tuesday night from his home in Florida.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States. Thank you, kids. Thank you. All of you. Thank you. Thank you. So many incredible friends and family here tonight. It's such a beautiful thing. Some people say, how do you speak before so many people all the time? When there's love in the room, it's really easy, if you want to know the truth. It really is. You ought to try it sometime. Together, we will be taking on the most corrupt forces and entrenched interests imaginable. Our country is in a horrible state. We're in grave trouble. This is not a task for a politician or a conventional candidate. This is a task for a great movement that embodies the courage, confidence, and the spirit of the American people. This is a movement. This is not for any one individual.
Former President Donald Trump Tuesday night at his Mar-a-Lago home in Palm Beach, Florida. The full announcement runs about an hour and 15 minutes. We covered it live on the C-SPAN networks. You can find the video at cspan.org. The former president trying to become only the second U.S. president to be defeated for re-election and then return to the White House after Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. Another potential 2024 Republican presidential candidate is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who was asked today whether there is a civil war brewing in the Republican Party after Donald Trump in the past couple of days has criticized DeSantis at rallies and in social media posts.
Now, Governor, do you fear that there may be a civil war brewing with the GOP with people having to Donald Trump?
No, look, I think we just finished this election, okay? People just need to chill out a little bit on some of this stuff. I mean, seriously, we just ran an election. We have this Georgia runoff coming, which is very important for Republicans to win that Georgia runoff. I mean, I know around the country, Florida was kind of the biggest bright spot. It was not so bright in many other parts of the country. It was a substandard performance given the dynamics that are at play. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. But I think what people like me who've been given the opportunity to continue is, okay, let's do something with that. And the reason why we won historic victory is at the end of the day, we led, we delivered, and we had your back when you needed us. That is why we won big. So the fact that, I mean, just think, literally, we have this election on last Tuesday. The next morning, I'm in the Emergency Operations Center in Tallahassee because of this storm on the east coast of Florida. And, of course, we're back here, within a week of that, helping Southwest Florida. So at the end of the day, I think what we showed in Florida is just produce results, lead with conviction. I never put my finger in the wind or took polls. I just did what I thought was right. But what the election gives us the opportunity to do is to continue to deliver. And so we're going to continue to deliver. We're not going to look back. And I think that that's very, very significant.
That's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at a news conference in Malacha, Florida today, an event unrelated to the 2024 presidential campaign, but a reporter taking the opportunity to ask that question. That coming from First Coast News in Florida. A YouGov poll conducted November 9th through 11th finds that among Republican voters, 41% favor Ron DeSantis for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination, 39% want Donald Trump, 8% want somebody else. The U.S. Senate today advancing a bill that would put the rights of same-sex marriage and interracial marriage into federal law. At least 60 votes were needed in the Senate on this procedural vote, and it got 62 to 37 noes. And of those yeses, 12 Republicans joining every Democrat. The supporters, including Senator Tammy Baldwin, say the bill is needed because the Supreme Court's rationale when it overturned the Roe v. Wade right to abortion earlier this year could apply in these cases.
The Supreme Court should not be in a position to undermine the stability of families with a stroke of the pen. So now Congress must act. And Congress is acting with a full-throated endorsement from the American people. More than 70% of Americans support marriage equality, including a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. This legislation unites Americans. With the Respect for Marriage Act, we can ease the fear that millions of same-sex and interracial couples have that their freedoms and their rights could be stripped away. By passing this bill, we are guaranteeing same-sex and interracial couples, regardless of where they live, that their marriage is legal and that they will continue to enjoy the rights and responsibilities that all other marriages are afforded. And this will give millions of loving couples the certainty, the dignity, and the respect that they need and that they deserve. For my dear friends, Margaret and Denise, and their daughter Maria, passing this legislation will remove the weight of the world from their backs. While they worry just like the rest of us about the cost of living and staying healthy and saving for retirement, passing this bill will take away a worry that someday their marriage might be on the chopping block at no fault of their own.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat, and first openly LGBTQ person to be elected to the U.S. Senate during today's debate. Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, speaking about an amendment added to the bill that he says will protect religious freedom, and that's why he's supporting the bill.
The first criticism that I've heard is that this bill does not sufficiently protect people of faith. I disagree. I believe religious freedom is a fundamental pillar of our constitutional order, and I'm confident nothing in this bill will diminish the religion and conscience protections that exist under the First Amendment or any other federal laws. To further advance and protect our cherished religious freedoms, However, our amendment contains 4 very important provisions. First, it acknowledges that decent and honorable people hold diverse views about the role of gender in marriage, and that such people and their beliefs are due respect. This is very important to many of the religious organizations we've dealt with who are strongly supporting this legislation, to make the point that people are going to have different points of view, and we're going to respect that. It also has a very important application to the lawsuits that people are concerned about that might come up. In the Bob Jones case, as an example, there was a notion that was different with regard to interracial marriage. In this case, though, with regard to same-sex marriage, again, we respect people who have different points of view, and it's important to lay that out. Secondly, it explicitly protects all existing religious liberty and conscience protections under the First Amendment, any other constitutional provisions, and federal law, explicitly. I would argue it already did that, but I think it's important to make it explicit. Third, it guarantees that this bill cannot be used to target or deny benefits, including tax-exempt status, which is very important to a lot of religious organizations. Also, grants, contracts, educational funding, licenses, many others. So religious organizations helped us to put this language in place just to ensure that this bill cannot be used for that purpose. Fourth, it ensures that nonprofit religious organizations, including churches, mosques, synagogues, religious schools, and others, cannot be required to provide facilities, goods, or services for marriage ceremonies or celebrations against their will.
Senator Rob Portman, Republican, on the Senate floor before that vote, procedural, to advance this bill. And it did advance 62-37. Senator Portman voting yes, along with 11 other Republicans. Blunt, Burr, Capito, Collins, Ernst, Lummis, Murkowski, Romney, Sullivan, Tillis, and Young. Final Senate passage of the bill could happen by the end of the week. The House passed a version in July without this religious liberty amendment that Senator Portman referred to. 47 Republicans voting yes on that bill. So if the Senate passes this version, the House would need to vote on that in order for it to be sent to the President to be signed into law. Immigration reform, another issue that the House and Senate Democratic majorities would like to pass and get signed into law before the end of the year. This from The Hill. The lame duck push is focusing on a bill to protect so-called dreamers, beneficiaries of the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The decision announced by House Democratic leaders during a closed-door meeting Tuesday morning in the Capitol comes just a week after the midterm elections when both parties were vying for a growing share of Hispanic voters. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, at a news conference outside the U.S. Capitol in favor of legislation on this issue, urging at least 10 Senate Republicans to cross over on this bill, support it, and clear that filibuster threshold.
But the election's now over, so all the BS, that was the word I was going to use, that we've heard from some of these Republican candidates, okay, well, the election's over. Now let's do the right thing. Now let's roll up our sleeves and get this done. Americans sent a clear message. They rejected the deeply anti-immigrant message of the MAGA Republicans. They said, MAGA Republicans, we don't believe in you. And one of the main reasons we don't believe in you is you divide us, and divide us by attacking immigrants. In just last week, we learned that Arizona, a purple state where the election was tight, approved a measure to extend in-state college tuition for non-citizens. That's not the politicians, that's the voters of Arizona, which has a virulent right wing, mostly who lost. But in any case, and they joined 18 other states, Arizona did, in putting this in place. Massachusetts, voters rejected a GOP effort to repeal a state law that allows undocumented immigrants to apply for a driver's license. So, on something as simple as DACA, when the public is clearly on our side in blue states, purple states, even red states, we're calling on Republican colleagues to join us. Waiting for our judicial system, hanging by a bare thread from court decision to court decision, is no way for anyone to have to live. It's cruel and inhumane to keep millions in limbo. It's past time DACA recipients feel safe in this country. So my message to Senate Republicans is this: work with us. Work with us on this widely supported policy so we can reach agreement that will protect families and strengthen our economy. just as we passed other bipartisan accomplishments which they thought couldn't be done. Guns, veterans, chips. We can get it done here.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at a news conference on the U.S. Capitol grounds in favor of this DACA reform bill. There's a story at the Texas Tribune that reads, in early October, a court case challenging the legality of the DACA program was sent back to a lower court in Texas after a 3-judge panel of the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with the lower court that the implementation of DACA in 2012 was illegal. But the court kept the program in place for the time being, allowing recipients to renew their status but preventing first-time applicants from applying. The case is anticipated to reach the U.S. Supreme Court, where the conservative majority could rule the program is illegal. Over to the U.S. House today, passing a bill that prohibits employers from requiring workers sign non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, when it comes to sexual assault or harassment claims as a condition of employment. This bill already passed the U.S. Senate, so now that it's passed the House, it goes to President Biden to be signed into law. The sponsor of the Speak Out Act is Congresswoman Lois Frankel, Democrat from Florida.
And businesses are using these NDAs to cover up their dirty little secrets of sexual abuse that force survivors to bear the trauma in silence. So it's not bad enough, Madam Speaker, that a survivor is humiliated, emotionally scarred, or physically hurt, that they have to quit their job or turn down promotion or leave the field entirely. If they are forced to sign an NDA before a dispute arises, they must suffer in silence and not even be able to tell a spouse, a parent, or a coworker. And if they do, they can be fired or disciplined or sued for damages and attorney's fees. That is crazy and that is unjust. The forced NDA punishes the survivor and protects the perpetrator, who is set to abuse and abuse and abuse again. So today we hold abusers accountable and change the culture of the workplace. Employers who are used to sweeping these stories under the rug will now be forced to stop toxic workplaces and sexual assault before it happens. And this should lead to safer, more productive workplaces and a civic society for all. And the change couldn't come soon enough. It's not just the movie and the TV personalities we've read about that have been the victims of sexual abuse in the workplace. 1 in 3 women, disproportionately women of color, have suffered sexual harassment in the workplace. There are 71 million women in the workplace. That's million and million of women who have to endure this.
Congresswoman Lois Frankel, Democrat, on the House floor during today's debate. Opposing this bill, Republican Congressman Dan Bishop of North Carolina, he says that he supported a bill earlier this year that became law that prohibits forced arbitration in sexual harassment and assault cases, but not today's bill.
The balance that we brought to the law by ensuring that every victim of sexual assault or harassment could come forward and sue. And if it is a suit against a public figure or against someone notorious or against someone rich or powerful, I got to tell you, that will get publicity. But it also is a system that has balance. People are subjected to discovery as to their motives. You have tools to find out and test the veracity of each side's views, each side's story. This bill gives the green light to the false accuser. This bill says resume speed. It's a resume speed sign to those who would make false accusations. We've brought balance to the law with the participation of Republicans and Democrats. I grant you that was a great bill. I congratulate you on bringing forward that bill, which I joined and voted for. This one is unfair and unbalanced. It goes too far.
Congressman Dan Bishop, Republican, on the House floor. The final vote on this bill, it did pass 315 to 109. 100 Republicans joining all Democrats in voting yes. The Senate unanimously passed the Speak Out Act in September by voice vote. So it now goes to President Biden for his signature. Wall Street today, the Dow down 39, NASDAQ down 174, S&P down 32. Washington today continues in a moment.
Live Thursday on C-SPAN Radio at 10:15 a.m. Eastern, a Senate Homeland Security hearing with testimony from Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and Christine Abizaid, Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. That's live Thursday, 10:15 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. Listen anywhere on your smart device. Say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts, and also on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. This story from Reuters: Russia has summoned the Polish ambassador to Moscow to the foreign ministry. Ministry spokeswoman said on Wednesday. Earlier, the Kremlin accused Poland of reacting in absolute hysterical fashion to Tuesday's incident when 2 people were killed by a missile in eastern Poland. Poland and NATO said on Wednesday it was probably a stray rocket fired by Ukraine's air defenses, and not, as some reports initially suggested, by Russia. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced that conclusion at a news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium.
Yesterday's explosion took place as Russia launched a massive wave of rocket attacks across Ukraine. Since the start of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, NATO has increased vigilance across our eastern flank, and we are monitoring the situation on a continuous basis. An investigation into this incident is ongoing, and we need to await its outcome. But we have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. And we have no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO. Our preliminary analysis suggests that the incident was likely caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile fired to defend Ukrainian territory against Russian cruise missile attacks. But let me be clear, this is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, and that audio from the NATO website. President Joe Biden at the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, said that Tuesday night he convened an emergency meeting with NATO and G7 leaders to discuss this incident, and that, then speaking to reporters, he said it appears likely that the explosion in the village in Poland near the Ukrainian border was not from a Russian missile. More today from the Pentagon and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
We were meeting today as Russia continues to target Ukraine's civilians and bombard its energy grid. But Russia's deliberate cruelty only deepens our resolve. And we'll continue to support Ukraine's bedrock right to defend itself and defend the rules-based international order. Yesterday, we saw reports of a deadly explosion in Poland near its border with Ukraine. I spoke last night to my Polish counterpart, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense, Błaszczak, and I conveyed my deep condolences to the Polish people and to the loved ones of those who were killed. I also underscored America's ironclad commitment to defend Poland. We have full confidence in the Polish government's investigation of this explosion, and they've been conducting that investigation in a professional and deliberate manner. And so we won't get ahead of their work. We're going to stay in close touch with our Polish counterparts, as well as with our NATO allies and other valued partners. We're still gathering information, but we have seen nothing that contradicts President Duda's preliminary assessment that this explosion was most likely the result of a Ukrainian air defense missile that unfortunately landed in Poland. And whatever the final conclusions may be, the world knows that Russia bears ultimate responsibility for this incident. Russia launched another barrage of missiles against Ukraine specifically intended to target Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. This tragic and troubling incident is yet another reminder of the recklessness of Russia's war of choice. And Ukraine has a bedrock right to defend itself.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin opening statement at today's news conference at the Pentagon. He was joined by General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a reporter asked about how he and his staff reacted to the news Tuesday night of that explosion in Poland.
After this strike occurred, did you reach out to your Russian counterparts, or did any other military officer reach out to their Russian counterparts to protect against escalation? And if not, why not?
I do that through my staff to set the calls up. The short answer is yes. Some attempts were made, no success. But the Russian counterpart I did talk to my Ukrainian counterpart immediately, General Zaluzny. Talked to him several times, in fact. Also Polish counterpart and several other shots in Europe. And exactly what the Secretary said, investigation's ongoing. There's professionals there to do the forensics, all the debris that's in and around the impact site and so on and so forth. And very shortly we'll know all the facts, and we just don't know them right this second.
So Russia did not take the call?
Right, my staff was unsuccessful in getting me linked up with General Gerasimov, that's correct.
General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at a Pentagon news conference along with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying today that his government has not seen proof that the missile that landed in Poland was Ukrainian, and that it's imperative that Ukraine be part of any investigation. And the Group of 20, or G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, with a final joint declaration that says, quote, "We deplore in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demand its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine." This is Washington today. The NASA administrator, Bill Young, tweeting very early Wednesday morning, "Liftoff. NASA Artemis is on its way to the moon." The Artemis 1 mission has been delayed for several months due to technical problems and bad weather. But the Orlando Sentinel reporting the sky turned from dark into light as the Space Launch System blasted out 8.8 million pounds of thrust to become the most powerful rocket to ever launch into space. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson leading off a news conference shortly after the launch.
I was standing on the roof of the LCC with a number of astronauts, and I'm telling you, we've never seen such a tail of flame. There were a bunch there that would like to be on that rocket. And I have to say, for what we saw tonight, it's an A+. It's a test flight. Took a long time coming to get here. Last time we were on the moon, Apollo 17, and we still have a long ways to go. And this is just the test flight. And we are stressing it and testing it in ways that we will not do to a rocket that has a human crew on it. But that's the purpose, to make it as safe as possible, as reliable as possible for when our astronauts crawl on board and go back to the moon. The enthusiasm throughout, not only this space center, even though a lot of America was in bed asleep, it will be apparent tomorrow. And the legacy that this professional crew put together in getting us to this day over the years is a legacy that indeed has been well earned and will continue as we now explore the heavens, as we go back to the moon, and then we go to Mars.
NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, The Orion spacecraft will spend 25 and a half days with several orbits around the moon, coming within 60 miles of its surface, and the return to Earth, the splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, scheduled for December 11th. As the administrator mentioned, Artemis 1, the first in a planned series of missions with the goals of establishing a permanent outpost on the moon and then using that as a springboard to explore other planets, especially Mars. Back to Capitol Hill, the U.S. House Rules Committee holding a hearing on the process for seating a non-voting delegate representing the Cherokee Nation, as was promised in an 1835 treaty with that tribe, which was ratified by the U.S. Senate and signed by then-President Andrew Jackson. Today, Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma, the ranking Republican on the Rules Committee, saying he supports the effort, but there are some lingering questions.
As a member of the Chickasaw Nation and co-chair of the Congressional Native American Caucus, I've always voiced my support for the federal government to honor its treaty obligations. For far too long in our nation's history, the federal government accumulated a sorry record of making promises to tribes and then breaking those promises as soon as it was expedient to do so. Only in recent years has the record improved. With today's hearing, we begin examination of a specific promise made in the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, and I certainly welcome the examination of this question by Congress. But it seems clear from the language of the treaty that this right is not self-executing and would require action by Congress to implement. As we consider this, members of the House have real questions about this issue, and the purpose of today's hearing is to begin examining those questions in detail. In addition to basic procedural questions, these questions will include: are there other tribes that have this right? Why did the tribe choose to select its delegate by council vote rather than by vote of the tribe? Are there concerns about double representation resulting in constituents being represented both by their geographic member of Congress and by a delegate from the tribe? Is this arrangement constitutional, and if so, what factors must be considered? How would the seating of a delegate change the character of the House, if it did at all? Many more.
Republican Congressman Tom Cole at today's hearing, the first hearing since the Cherokee Nation did name a delegate designate. Kim Teehee, a Cherokee Nation official with years of experience in Washington, did that in 2019. The New York Times reports, delayed by the pandemic and mindful that a new Congress in January may force them to restart the process, tribal leaders have accelerated their campaign to have a vote on the House floor to approve her seat. One of the witnesses today, Chuck Hoskin, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief. Here's Congressman Tom Cole asking him why it took almost 200 years to get to this point.
I get this question a lot, so I want to pose it to you. Obviously, this is an old treaty right, 1835. Why was it not addressed or impressed immediately? And I would also take that on advisement. I mean, I'm delighted to hear your answer, but if you have additional information later from historians or whomever, I mean, that's a question I get. Well, gosh, if this was there and it was a treaty, why wasn't it done immediately at the time? Why didn't the Cherokee Nation, and maybe it did, advance the claim at the time?
Well, Congressman, I love this question because it gives me an opportunity to talk about Cherokee history, of which there's not enough knowledge in this country.
That's why I opened the door.
You certainly possess it, but I won't miss the opportunity. The history since 1835 with the Cherokee Nation has been one of rebuilding and then being suppressed again, being oppressed again, being dispossessed. Seem to be in rebuilding modes through the last 2 centuries. Think about what happened. The Trail of Tears came after the Treaty of New Echota, nearly destroyed the Cherokee Nation, lost a quarter of our population, ripped apart our institutions, was the near destruction of the Cherokee Nation. We rebuilt. That story, Mr. Chairman, ought to be an entire story that every American understands, because our rebuilding is incredible. But it took a great deal of resources. So when we get to our new homeland and what would later become Oklahoma, we are simply trying to survive and rebuild a great society. Decades go by, the Civil War visits the Cherokee Nation and brings even more destruction and division than the Trail of Tears, if you can imagine that. We go into another period of rebuilding in the post-Civil War era, late in the 19th century. At the turn of the 20th century, as we know, the state of Oklahoma is created by the Congress of the United States. A number of federal Indian laws are passed, which again dispossess Cherokee people of our collective possessions, our lands, nearly dispossesses us of our government. I think, Congressman, a lot about my grandfather in this role. Let's get into the 20th century. My grandfather's century, a full-blood Cherokee World War II veteran, the United States suppressed the democracy of the Cherokee Nation to such a degree that he could not vote for a chief of the Cherokee Nation during most of his lifetime. I don't imagine he ever thought his grandson would be the elected chief of the Cherokee Nation. But in the 1970s, we start to rebuild, and we've been on a trajectory, as has other tribes in Oklahoma and across this country, of building economic strength, prosperity back home. And so we are now, I think, in a position where we can, as a practical matter, assert this right, whereas my predecessors in the 2 centuries before, frankly, we were just trying to hang on to our way of life and rebuild. So that's the explanation.
Chuck Hoskin is Cherokee Nation Principal Chief, testifying before the House Rules Committee. The question coming from the ranking Republican on the committee, Tom Cole of Oklahoma. Cherokee.org has this. Today, the Cherokee Nation is the largest tribe in the United States with more than 430,000 tribal citizens worldwide. More than 141,000 Cherokee Nation citizens reside within the tribe's reservation boundaries in northeastern Oklahoma. And if a delegate from the Cherokee Nation is seated in the House, he or she would join delegates in the House from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and Washington, D.C. And there's also a non-voting member of the U.S. House from Puerto Rico with the title Resident Commissioner. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about, delivered to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.